Hi students, today's video lecture is going to give you a pretty broad overview of the kingdom fungi. If you recall, when we talked about protists, we were saying that protists were evolved into plants, animals, and fungi. So today we're going to talk about fungi, and from here we then go to plants. So the kingdom fungi is extremely diverse. It has over 80,000 species. And here are some pictures of some. What we look down here by the strawberries, you probably see this with old fruit. What we call mold is really a fungi. Also, what we eat when we eat mushrooms, or sometimes you see mushrooms growing in damp areas, those are also fungi. So how do we categorize them, and what characteristics do they have as a kingdom? So they're mostly multicellular. The only exception for the multicellular ones are ones we've already worked with. If you recall, yeast. So yeast, we did that with our fermentation lab with the juices. That's a fungi, but that's a single-celled fungi. But otherwise, they're multicellular, and they're eukaryotes, right? So now we're not talking about prokaryotes like the bacteria. We're talking about eukaryotic cells, and they share this common mode of nutrition. So originally, biologists used to classify fungi with plants because, they see them growing from the ground. They don't move, right, visibly in our eyes. So they kind of lumped them as plants, except that fungi don't photosynthesize. Fungi are actually heterotrophic, right? Remember what hetero versus autotroph? So hetero, other feeders. Heterotrophs, they feed on other organisms. So the specific type of heterotrophs they are what we refer to as saprotrophs, or sometimes this is called a saprophyte. So this is very unique to fungi. What they do is that they release digestive enzymes outside of their cells into, like, let's say the ground where there is a log. And those enzymes break down that organic matter into smaller and smaller particles, and then they can take them in as those smaller particles. So it's kind of like what we do in our digestive system. We eat a big chunk of food, and in our digestive system, our enzymes break it down. But with fungi, they release the enzymes out. They digest it outside extracellularly, and then they take the smaller pieces in. So that's the unique thing called saprotroph. But it's still a type of heterotroph, right? Because they're feeding on other things. As saprophytes, they're actually really important in the environment because when they do this, they decompose. So that's why sometimes when you see like a dead log, you'll see like white stuff in it. If you open it up, that's actually a fungi. There are also some that are parasitic. Now, this would still mean it's a heterotroph, but instead of feeding on something dead or decaying, they're feeding on something alive. Like we're going to show you some different types of parasites. Okay, so this is pretty important. Protists, right? We've talked about protists. They evolved about 1.5 billion years ago. And all of plants, animals, and fungi evolved from protists. How do we know this? Molecular data, right? And animals and fungi are actually more closely related to each other than to plants. So even though originally they put fungi and plants together, now, because of molecular data, we find that fungi and animals are actually more closely related to each other than they are to plants, than either are to plants. And we're going to talk about why that is. So some characteristics of fungi. All right, so here's an image that kind of shows it. What you may be familiar with is this mushroom, but actually the main body of the fungi is usually underground, okay? And it's referred to as a mycelium right here, mycelium. So the whole body is called the mycelium, but the mycelium is made up of these threads that are called hyphae. right? So here's what it said: consists of a vast network of thread-like hyphae. So the mycelia consists of this. And the reason that they've evolved to grow like this is because this hyphae is like threads, and it allows them, remember we talked about surface area to volume ratio in the beginning of the semester? Well, these hyphae have a ton of surface area. And remember how we talked about how they digest things. They release it out and absorb it. So all of these threads can be doing that saprophytic form of digestion, right? So it gives them a lot of surface area to absorb nutrients and to absorb water. They have cell walls, right? Like bacteria do, like plants do. But the cell wall, and actually animals have cell wall. If you think of insects, the hard part that has cell wall. The cell walls, actually they don't have cell walls. They have chitin. So let me just rephrase that. Animals don't have cell wall, but they have in their exoskeleton the material that the cell wall of the fungi have. So these hyphae sometimes can have cell walls separating the cells, and that is made out of chitin, which is the same material that insects have. Another piece of evidence that shows animal and fungi are closely related. Excess nutrients, energy, is stored as glycogen, and that's, remember from the beginning of the semester, that's how animals store excess glucose, so another similarity. Again, plants and animals and fungi transfer evolutionary to protists. Animal and fungi share a common ancestor, and we think that that split happened after plants. They are heterotrophs, just like animals. They have chitin in their cell wall, and there's genetic similarities. All right. The way we classify fungi is always changing. And in taxonomy, remember when we did that phylogenetic tree and I gave you the gummy worms to add? Well, that's always happening as we discover new species. And with fungi, they're always discovering new ones, and so it's always rearranging. So I'm going to really briefly just tell you 3 groups, and we're going to look at some of them in lab as well. And so some of the 3 main groups, if you see here, common answer, one of the most ancient ones, right, are the Zygomycota, and these are the ones that produce the mold we talk about, and we'll get a little more into that. Then there's the Basidiomycota, which are like the club fungi. These are the ones that when you buy mushrooms in the grocery store, right, the mushrooms is the fruiting body of these Basidiomycota, all of them that look like your typical mushroom. And then the Ascomycota are called sac fungi too. And if anyone's heard of like hunting for morel mushrooms, that's what these are. But they're a little different than just your typical mushrooms. You can see they look slightly different. These are also a lot of parasitic ones that cause plant diseases like Dutch elm disease. Now, we're not going to go through the life cycle of each of these groups, but I do want to highlight some characteristics about fungi's life cycle that has allowed them to really evolve and adapt and be successful, a successful group of organisms. So I'm going to show you a representation of a life cycle of the Zygomycota. They produce what we commonly call black bread mold. So if you've probably seen this, if you've had bread that's old, it looks, here's this picture, right? It starts to look like this. This stuff growing on it probably didn't get this bad, but that's a fungi. And one thing I want to point out is that fungi can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So remember, sexually it would be 2 different organisms joining their genetic material to produce the offspring. Asexually is 1 organism producing offspring. And why is this important? Because sexual reproduction has the advantage of allowing for more genetic variation because you're joining 2 different organisms, and the offspring are a combination of those genes that can maybe have an advantage in an environment. But what if you can't find a mate, right? What if there's only one? Well, then they can reproduce asexually and still survive. So a few things about the structures and how this works. If we start here, let's look at something we've already talked about. Remember what the mycelium was. The mycelium was the body that's underground, right? It's produced out of hyphae, and you can see these little threads. And so if there is no mate around, the mycelium produce these structures called sporangium that pop out that hold spores, right? So spores, here I wrote it, are a reproductive cell that does not need to fuse with another reproductive cell in order to make a new organism. So asexually, right, the hyphae, the mycelium produce the sporangium, which releases spores and can just germinate, can just start growing into another mycelium. So they can reproduce like this, asexually. Or, do you see how it says mating type minus, mating type plus? Two different myceliums, the hyphae can fuse, and the cytoplasm fuses between these cells. The nuclei join together, and they see mating type minus, mating type plus, and they produce this structure called a zygospore, which is the sexual reproductive structure, not found when they reproduce asexually. And that's where the group gets its name. Now that zygospore can also produce a sporangium and spores. Just the difference now is those spores are a result of sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. So fungi have this unique way of reproducing both sexually and asexually. Their names of these structures, usually a sporangium produces spores. Spores germinate to make the offspring, right? The other thing I will say is that when we go to lab, we're going to look at mushrooms. So mushrooms, right, in the Basidiomycota are the reproductive, the fruiting body. And the mushroom, instead of the sporangium, are going to produce the spores that get released out, right? Well, they're going to actually have little sporangium inside of them, but they're the fruiting body. Fungi can also be parasitic. So if you've ever heard of ringworm or athlete's foot, so here's a picture of ringworm, here's an athlete's foot. Those are actually fungi that are the mycelium, the structures are growing and feeding off of your cells and in between your toes. And sometimes it can look white because that mycelium is growing through it. And so that would still be heterotrophic, right? But instead of feeding on something dead, and it could even be still saprotrophs, but even instead of feeding on something dead or decaying, they're feeding on an organism that's alive. They do this with plants too. A lot of mildews, a lot of like the Dutch elm disease are all fungi. And so ringworm and athlete's foot has to be treated not with an antibiotic, because antibiotics are actually for bacterial infections, but has to be treated with an antifungal. The one thing that reminds me of that I should note is that we've actually obtained some of our best antibiotics from chemicals that fungi make to defend themselves against bacteria, right? So antibiotics are used to fight bacteria, and fungi naturally produce this actually penicillin we got from fungi. Fungi produced it to protect themselves from bacteria. We take that penicillin, use it to protect ourselves from bacteria. All right. Lastly, I just want to briefly say that there's symbiotic, right? So symbiotic associations are very close associations with two different organisms that depend on each other. And the relationships sometimes can be beneficial, or sometimes they can be not beneficial. Like parasitism is an association between two organisms where one benefits and the other is harmed. Like with ringworm, the fungi benefit, the human is harmed. Lichens, here's some pictures. So you've probably seen these growing on trunks of trees, or this is a rock here. So lichens is an association between fungi and either cyanobacteria. Remember, that was one of the that was like the bacteria that can photosynthesize and gave oxygen to our earth. or a green algae, a single cell green algae like a protist, association between those two. It was thought that it was a mutualistic relationship. The fungi, remember the mycelium, the body with the hyphae, kind of protect the cyanobacteria and give it a moist environment where it otherwise could not live. So normally cyanobacteria live in water. They couldn't just live on a rock, but the fungi give it like a moist environment. And in turn, the cyanobacteria, the algae, photosynthesize, and the hyphae of the fungi kind of go into it and take the nutrients. Now there's thought that maybe it's more parasitic. We'll talk about it in lab. But it's a very important environmental organism because they're what we refer to as pioneer species often. They're like the first, let's say a volcano, right? A volcano exists and it leaves molten lava rock in the environment, and then there's nothing living. Well, lichens are one of those first organisms that can colonize the area, and from the lichens living there, they're adding organic material that allows then other organisms to live there as well successionally. Okay, so this is what I said. Specialized fungal hyphae penetrate the photosynthetic cyanobacteria. Nutrients are transferred to the fungus from the cyanobacteria because they can photosynthesize, right? Because if not, on a rock, the fungi wouldn't be able to get any organic matter. And then the hyphae provide a moist environment for the cyanobacteria. Okay, we'll be looking at fungi and talking more about this in lab next week. Take care.